your emergency fund is basically useless. I don't care if you followed all the traditional advice and saved 3 months of expenses or even 6 months. In 2026, that's not an emergency fund. That's a false sense of security that's going to evaporate the moment something actually goes wrong. The rules changed and nobody updated the playbook, which means millions of people think they're financially prepared when they're actually one crisis away from complete disaster. My name is Alicia, and I've been watching people get blindsided by emergencies that their supposedly adequate emergency funds couldn't handle. If you think your emergency fund is protecting you, or if you want to understand why the old advice about emergency funds is dangerously outdated, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button if this information helps you out. Here's what everyone still believes about emergency funds. Save 3 to 6 months of expenses in a high-yield savings account and you're covered. That advice made perfect sense in 2010. It makes zero sense in 2026. The cost of emergencies has exploded, the frequency of emergencies has increased, and the types of emergencies people face are completely different than what the traditional advice was designed for. But everyone's still following outdated guidance and calling it financial responsibility. Let me show you exactly why your emergency fund is too small by walking through what actually happens when real emergencies hit real people in 2026. Meet Jennifer. She's 29, makes $72,000 a year, and she did everything right according to traditional financial advice. Her monthly expenses are about $4,000, so she saved up $18,000 as a 6-month emergency fund. She felt great about it. She was more prepared than most of her friends. She thought she was financially secure. Then she got laid off. Tech industry contraction. Nothing personal. They just eliminated her entire department. She wasn't too worried at first because she had that $18,000 cushion. 6 months to find another job seemed like plenty of time. Here's what actually happened. Month 1, she filed for unemployment and started job hunting. Unemployment gave her about $450 a week, roughly $1,800 a month. Her expenses were still $4,000, so she pulled $2,200 from her emergency fund. Balance, $15,800. Month 2, still searching. The market is brutal. Everyone in her field got laid off at the same time, and they're all competing for the same positions. She had to fly to another city for a promising interview. That's $800 she couldn't avoid spending if she wanted the job. She didn't get it. Pulled another $2,200 for expenses. Balance, $12,800. Month 3, her car broke down. Major repair, $2,800. She could have limped along with a cheaper fix, but she needs the car reliable for when she does find a job. Between the car repair and her regular expenses, she pulled $5,000 from her emergency fund this month. Balance, $7,800. Month 4, she finally gets a job offer. It pays $68,000, slightly less than before, but she needs income. There's one problem. It's in a different city. Moving costs are brutal. Security deposit, first month's rent, moving truck, travel expenses, all the setup costs for a new apartment. That's another $6,000. Her emergency fund is down to $1,800, and she hasn't even started her new job yet. She's forced to put some of the moving costs on a credit card. She thought 6 months of expenses would be enough. In reality, her emergency fund lasted exactly 4 months, and that's assuming nothing else went wrong. No medical emergencies. No dental work, no unexpected family obligations, just a job loss, a car repair, and the costs of getting back to work. And now she's starting her new job with credit card debt and a depleted emergency fund, more financially vulnerable than before the emergency happened. This is the reality of emergencies in 2026. They're more expensive than they used to be. They happen more frequently, and they compound on each other in ways that the traditional 3 to 6 month advice never accounted for. That advice was created in a world where emergencies were isolated incidents. Your car breaks down, or you lose your job, or you have a medical bill. One thing at a time. But that's not how life works anymore. Let's talk about why the cost of emergencies has exploded. Car repairs that used to cost $800 now cost $2,000 because modern cars are basically computers on wheels. You can't just replace a part anymore. You need specialized diagnostic equipment and proprietary software. Medical emergencies are worse. Even with insurance, an unexpected hospital visit can easily cost $3,000 to $5,000 in deductibles and out-of-pocket maximums. Dental emergencies. Root canals are $2,000 per tooth. Home repairs if you own a house. A new HVAC system is $8,000 to $12,000. A roof replacement is $15,000 to $30,000. The traditional emergency fund advice assumed emergencies would cost maybe $1,000 to $2,000, manageable amounts that wouldn't devastate your 6-month cushion. But in 2026, a single emergency can wipe out 20 to 30% of your emergency fund, even if you save the recommended amount. Have 2 emergencies in the same 6-month period, which is not uncommon, and you're basically broke despite having done everything the experts told you to do. Here's another problem with the traditional advice. It calculates your emergency fund based on your current monthly expenses, but emergency expenses don't care about your budget. When you lose your job, your expenses don't magically drop to match your reduced income. In fact, they often increase. You're driving more for job interviews. You're spending more on professional development or certifications to make yourself more marketable. You might need to relocate for a new opportunity. You're eating worse because you're stressed, which leads to health issues, which leads to medical expenses. Jennifer's $4,000 monthly budget was based on her normal life, where she had income and routine. Once the emergency hit, her actual spending was closer to $5,000 a month when you factor in job search costs, the car repair, the moving expenses, and all the small increases that happen when your life is chaotic. Her 6-month emergency fund based on $4,000 months should have given her $24,000 of runway. But with actual emergency spending at $5,000 a month plus major one-time costs, she ran out in 4 months. Now let's talk about the biggest change in emergencies that the old advice never anticipated. Job loss takes way longer to recover from than it used to. The traditional advice assumed you could find another job in your field within 3 to 6 months. That might have been realistic 20 years ago. It's fantasy now. The average job search in 2026 takes 4 to 8 months for professional positions, longer if you're in a specialized field or if you were laid off during an industry contraction when everyone else in your field is also looking. This means the old 3 to 6 month emergency fund was designed for a world that doesn't exist anymore. If the average job search takes 6 months, having 6 months of expenses saved means you're running out of money right when you're most likely to find a job, but before you've actually started earning again. You find a job in month 6, but you don't get your first paycheck until month 7. Your emergency fund is gone. You're taking on debt to bridge that final month. This is exactly what happened to Jennifer, but it gets worse. Let's talk about what I call emergency fund erosion, something that nobody discusses but that affects everyone. Your emergency fund is supposed to sit there safely in a high-yield savings account earning interest until you need it. In theory, it's protected. In reality, it's being slowly destroyed by inflation even while it's just sitting there doing its job. Inflation in 2026 is still running higher than the interest rates on savings accounts. Your high-yield savings account might be earning 4%. Inflation is running at 5 to 6% for the things people actually buy regularly. Your emergency fund is losing 1 to 2% of its purchasing power every year just by existing. That $18,000 emergency fund Jennifer saved? By the time she needed it 2 years later, it had the purchasing power of maybe $16,500 when measured against actual emergency costs. This is why your emergency fund feels like it's never enough, even when you hit the target amount. You saved 6 months of expenses based on what things cost when you started saving. By the time you need it, everything costs more. The car repair would have been $1,800 2 years ago is now $2,800. The moving costs that would have been $4,000 are now $6,000. Your emergency fund amount stayed the same, but the emergencies got more expensive. So what's the actual right size for an emergency fund in 2026? It's not 3 months. It's not 6 months. For most people, it needs to be closer to 12 months of expenses minimum. And here's why. 12 months gives you real protection against the modern reality of emergencies. It accounts for the longer job search timeline. It gives you buffer for the fact that emergencies are more expensive and often happen in clusters. It provides cushion for the purchasing power erosion that happens while the money sits there. But even 12 months might not be enough depending on your situation. If you work in a volatile industry where layoffs are common, you need more. If you're self-employed and your income fluctuates, you need more. If you have dependents who rely on your income, you need more. If you have chronic health issues that could flare up, you need more. If you own a home instead of renting, you definitely need more because home emergencies are catastrophically expensive. Let me show you what adequate emergency fund looks like for someone making the same $72,000 that Jennifer made. After taxes, she's taking home about $54,000, roughly $4,500 per month. Her expenses are $4,000. Traditional advice says save $18,000 to $24,000. I'm saying she needs at least $48,000, a full year of expenses at her current spending level, and ideally closer to $60,000 to account for increased emergency spending and inflation erosion. I can hear you screaming at your screen right now. $60,000 in an emergency fund? That's insane. That's way too much money sitting there earning basically nothing. That could be invested and growing. You're absolutely right that it feels like a lot. You're absolutely wrong that it's too much. Let me show you why. Sarah learned this lesson the hard way. She's 34, makes $85,000 a year, expenses around $5,000 monthly. She saved the traditional 6-month emergency fund, $30,000. Then she got pregnant. Complicated pregnancy, put on bed rest at 7 months. She couldn't work for the last 2 months of pregnancy and took 3 months of partially paid maternity leave after the baby was born. That's 5 months of reduced or zero income right there. During this time, her medical expenses with insurance were $8,000. The baby needed some unexpected equipment and supplies, another $3,000. They had to hire help for household tasks she couldn't do while on bed rest, $2,000. Her husband took unpaid time off to help with the baby, costing them another $4,000 in lost income. And their regular expenses continued. $5,000 per month for 5 months is $25,000. Let's add that up. $8,000 medical, $3,000 baby supplies, $2,000 household help, $4,000 lost income from husband, $25,000 regular expenses. Total, $42,000. Her $30,000 emergency fund was gone in under 4 months, and they ended up with $12,000 in credit card debt despite her having what everyone told her was an adequate emergency fund. This is why the traditional advice is dangerous. It's not that it's wrong exactly, it's that it's incomplete. It assumes emergencies are simple and isolated. Real emergencies are complex and cascading. One thing goes wrong, which causes another thing to go wrong, which causes another thing to go wrong. And modern emergencies are expensive in ways they simply weren't 20 years ago. Here's another factor nobody talks about. The emergency fund needs to cover not just your expenses, but also the cost of fixing the actual emergency. When Jennifer lost her job, she needed money to live on, yes, but she also needed money to find a new job. Interview clothes, travel for interviews, potentially relocation. When Sarah had pregnancy complications, she needed money to live on, yes, but she also needed money for medical care and baby supplies and help around in the house. The emergency fund has to do 2 jobs simultaneously, replace your income, and pay for fixing the crisis. The traditional 3 to 6 months calculation only considers the first job, replacing income. It completely ignores the second job, which often costs just as much or more. Let's talk about what happens if you're self-employed or have variable income, because the traditional advice is even more inadequate for you. If you're a freelancer or contractor or small business owner, you don't get unemployment benefits when work dries up. You don't have a steady paycheck. Your income might be great one month and terrible the next. For you, an emergency fund isn't just for catastrophic events, it's essential infrastructure for managing normal income volatility. If you're self-employed and you're following the traditional 3 to 6 month advice, you're playing financial Russian roulette. You need a minimum of 12 months of expenses saved, probably more like 18 to 24 months. Why? Because your emergencies aren't just personal crises, they're also business crises. Your biggest client doesn't renew their contract. The market shifts and demand for your services drops. You get sick and can't work for a while. Equipment breaks and needs replacing. These are emergencies that employed people don't face, but that are completely normal and expected parts of self-employment. Marcus learned this the hard way. He's a freelance graphic designer making about $90,000 a year. He saved $36,000 as his 6-month emergency fund, feeling really good about being above the traditional recommendation. Then his 2 biggest clients, who represented 60% of his income, both ended their contracts within a month of each other. Not because he did bad work, just because their budgets got cut and freelancers are the first to go. His income dropped from $7,500 a month to $3,000. His expenses were $5,500. He needed to find new clients, which took time and effort and money for marketing and networking. He went 5 months before replacing that lost income, burning through $27,000 of his emergency fund. He thought he was being responsible with 6 months saved. In reality, he barely survived a completely predictable and normal freelance emergency. Now let's address the biggest objection to having a large emergency fund: opportunity cost. Every dollar sitting in your emergency fund earning 4% could be invested in the stock market, potentially earning 8 or 10%. Over time, that difference compounds significantly. If you have $60,000 sitting in a savings account instead of the stock market, you're potentially missing out on thousands of dollars in returns every year. This is a real concern, and it's why you need to think strategically about your emergency fund size relative to your total wealth. If your net worth is $60,000 and it's all in your emergency fund, yes, that's probably too conservative. You should have some money invested for growth. But if your net worth is $300,000 and $60,000 is in your emergency fund, while $240,000 is invested, that's actually a very reasonable allocation. The people who build real wealth understand something that broke people don't. You need both security and growth. Your emergency fund provides security. Your investments provide growth. You need both, not one or the other. The mistake most people make is either having too much in emergency funds and not enough invested, or having too much invested and not enough emergency cushion. Both extremes are problematic. Here's my framework for thinking about emergency fund size in 2026. Start with 12 months of current expenses as your baseline. That's your minimum target. Add 3 months of expenses if you work in a volatile industry or have variable income. Add 3 months if you own a home instead of renting. Add 3 months if you have dependents. Add 3 months if you have any chronic health issues. Add 3 months if you're self-employed. Add 6 months if you're the sole income earner for your household. Using this framework, someone who is self-employed, owns a home, and has 2 kids should be targeting about 24 months of expenses in their emergency fund. That's not conservative, that's realistic, based on the actual risks they face and the actual costs of emergencies in 2026. Yes, it's a lot of money. Yes, it takes time to save. Yes, you could be investing it instead. But you know what's more expensive than missing out on investment returns? Going into debt because you didn't have enough emergency savings when a real crisis hit. Jennifer eventually rebuilt her life. She paid off that credit card debt from her moving costs. She built her emergency fund back up, but this time she ignored the traditional advice. She's now 32, makes $80,000 a year, and has $55,000 in her emergency fund. Her friends think she's being too conservative. She knows she's being realistic because she lived through what happens when your emergency fund is too small. Here's the final piece that makes this urgent in 2026 specifically. We're living in an increasingly unstable economic environment. Job security is lower than it's been in decades. Industries are being disrupted rapidly. Climate change is increasing the frequency of natural disasters. Healthcare costs keep rising faster than wages. The political environment is creating economic uncertainty. All of these factors increase both the likelihood and the cost of emergencies. The emergency fund advice from 10 or 20 years ago was created for a more stable world. We don't live in that world anymore. The risks are higher, the costs are higher, and the recovery time is longer. Your emergency fund needs to reflect this new reality, not the reality from when your parents were building their careers. So here's what you do. Stop following the traditional 3 to 6 month advice. Calculate what 12 months of expenses actually looks like for you. Add extra months based on your risk factors. Start building toward that number aggressively. Yes, it's going to take time. Yes, you'll be sacrificing some investment growth in the short term, but you'll also be building real financial security instead of just the illusion of it. Your emergency fund isn't too small because you're bad at saving. It's too small because you followed advice that's dangerously outdated for the world we actually live in. Most people won't update their targets because 12 months sounds extreme and nobody wants to keep that much money in cash. Those people will learn the hard way, just like Jennifer and Sarah and Marcus did, that the traditional advice doesn't protect you anymore. But you don't have to learn the hard way. You can choose to build real security now, before you need it, because by the time you realize your emergency fund is too small, it's already too late.